So when you're thinking about where we're at as a nation, the cognitive dissonance, the cognitive distortion, the perception distortion, confirmation bias, all of these things play a role. And it's more than just a biological or physiological and psychological, although that does play a role. There is a reality going on beyond it, a meta reality, a spiritual reality that's going on in the flesh. And so when there's fear, especially if you're doing something you know is wrong, or sin in this case, right? The accuser comes in and accuses you, brings in fear and confusion and accusation. Now, there's a cleansing process from the inside out. You know something's wrong, right? So sin comes in like a flood. And it will have dramatic impacts on you as a person. And it affects everything about you. Now, I tell you that in that there is we're in a very complex world and a very complex reality right now. And that has definitive impacts upon how we perceive things. But when you're constantly being bombarded, being set up, that flood of filth, of temptation, of accusation, all of those things conspire together. And so when we talk about like the cup of Mystery Babylon, one of the things that is it creates the conditions, both in the flesh and in the mind, and then bombards it. So it's a constant battering ram, a constant attack, a constant flood of filth, temptation. And it essentially sits in your mortal coils from a spiritual perspective. And it tries to hold you hostage, tries to make you a slave to it. And then it does that through ruling dictatorially like a tyrant in your own mortal coils and in your own mind. So that's why pharmakia is such a big deal, right? It creates conditions in people's minds and bodies that is very difficult for people to overcome, and especially if they don't understand what's going on, right? We all need grace. But when you are also in a society that is just constant bombardment by lies, by temptation, by filth, and then you look at that from a social engineering point of view, and you look at it from a peer group influence point of view, you start to see what I mean by this. It is an entire systematic co-opting of people. So when the Lord says that your enemy is your own flesh, the world, and your adversary, Satan, there is a systematic reality to that plays out in the micros and the macros. And it's not something that most people understand or comprehend. And it's not well delineated by a lot of folks. Because there is a real physiological, psychological, and spiritual interplay that occurs both in the micros and the macros. So when you think about that in terms of Satan is the power of the air, the prince of the air, and you think about what travels in the air, right? Well, you've got pollution and things like that, but I want you to think of it in terms of signals, right? In terms of broadcasting, waves, sound waves, right? Electromagnetic spectrum, video transmissions. When you think of it in those terms, you start getting a portrait of kind of what I mean by the Prince of the Air and how that functions in and of and upon your own flesh, at the micros and the macros. It creates a synthetic reality that's like a template, right? Like a film that is laid over the individual, their perceptions, their thinking, and even their physicality. That's a big deal. When you really think about what I'm telling you, it's a big deal. And you start to understand why sowing the wind always leads to reaping the whirlwind. So think about it from that point of view. And let's dive into this a little more here in a little bit. Okay?